On episode 181 of the 40 Plus Fitness podcast, we meet Jeff Scott Phillips and discuss his book, Big Fat Food Fraud, Confessions of a Health Food Hustler. You can find the full show notes for this episode at 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/181. And we don't have any salty language in this episode, but the book itself does kind of have some stories that wouldn't be appropriate to a younger audience. But again, I made sure in this podcast we didn't get into those stories. But if you do go out and buy the book, just be aware that there is some pretty seedy little stories in this that are about more than just his issues of serving health food and doing health food industry. But it's a really eye-opening podcast episode, and I do hope you appreciate it. Have you decided you're ready to make a change? To reclaim your health and fitness? The 40 Plus Fitness podcast is here for you. I'm your host, Alan Meisner. I'm an NSAM certified personal trainer with a specialization in corrective exercise and fitness nutrition. Let me be your coach as you find your way on your health and fitness journey. All right, let's go. Jeff Scott Phillips is a nutritionist, and after launching his own health food brand, he realized that there was a seedy side to the way that labeling and health food are actually done in this country. And in this book, Big Fat Food Fraud, he shares some of the secrets, some of the things that he learned about the industry, some of the practices he actually implemented in his business or had to implement in his business to remain competitive in such a hardcore industry. It's a kind of an eye-opening book, and it's a great conversation, so I hope you enjoy it. Without further ado, here's Jeff Scott Phillips. So Jeff, welcome to 40 Plus Fitness.
Thank you very much for having me.
You know, your book, Big Fat Food Fraud, you guys sent me a little snack to go along with it, you know, and I like sitting down sometimes and reading, having a glass of wine and eating a snack. And it had a very interesting label. And if you kind of go through that label, and it's GMO-free, soy-free, low sodium, hormone-free, paleo-friendly, carb-free, grass-fed, no sugar added, on and on and on. I thought, you know, I'm gonna save this so I could open it up while we're doing the podcast. And then I got to the end of the book, towards the end of the book, and you were showing a presentation. And in one of those presentations, you were comparing food labels. And since one of the items on that food label was not something I necessarily wanted to eat, even though it had an okay food label to it, I don't think I'm going to open this, and I don't think I'm going to eat it.
Well, that's a good choice on your part.
So no disrespect that I'm not eating the little snack that they sent along with the book, but it's actually an awesome business card, and it's something I'll keep with me just as a reminder that you know, food labels aren't always what we need them to be.
You know what's funny? You know why we sent that and why we chose that particular method of getting attention was because so we put that label because this is what we did. We made food labels and we listed the nutrition facts and the ingredients and all that. That bar, if and when you choose to open it up, is just a chocolate bar. There's nothing healthy about it, but we were kind of proving the point that, see, we can say whatever we want and no one's stopping us from that. It's just a chocolate bar. There's nothing healthy about it. It's not GMO free.
And so, yeah, you actually had it as a quote. I want to quote you because you did a presentation, and this was a quote from that presentation that I think is really something that will set the tone for our conversation today. But it's the cold truth is food labels aren't there to educate you. They're there to help us market to you. And so you're coming at this from now being an industry insider, kind of going through it. And the book is kind of your story as you got into this business, coming through, kind of helping your clients, wanting to help people, starting a food preparation company because convenience is something that we value, particularly in the Western cultures, of just having our food available to us. So, you know, prepared meals are actually now getting bigger and bigger as we kind of, you know, get into people wanting to have a healthy lifestyle, but, you know, also still wanting the convenience of the McDonald's. You know, this is as close as it gets, is having these prepared meals. But what you found is, as you kind of got into it, is that the rules are a little ambiguous, and the individuals, or I guess the groups that are responsible for making the rules and or the regulations and or policing them are not necessarily spot on. And so you tell a story in the book about how you knew the ingredients of what you were doing. You knew there were scientific studies that said that, if you ate this way, it was beneficial towards reducing or maybe preventing or maybe even reversing type 2 diabetes. And you wanted to put that on the food label because you felt that was really important for people to understand that the food you were making was intended to be healthy. And you started making some phone calls to try to find someone that could help you understand if you could or couldn't put that on a label. Can you kind of talk us through that story?
Yeah, when we were starting out, this wasn't when we were starting out. This was when I had taken it to the next level. I already had investors at this point, and we were becoming a food manufacturing business. And so we started off we moved into a USDA regulated kitchen. So we had literally every day on site, there's a USDA agent not monitoring what we did. That's not what the USDA does. What they do is they monitor everything in retrospect. So you document it and then they look at it afterwards. But I could tell you a whole nother story about that. But anyway, so we were working with the USDA and we wanted to see what claims we could make, whether it's helping people reverse the type 2 diabetes, which we had good evidence of, good testimonials or whatever it might be. And the USDA agent on site, he told us, I have no idea. He's like, I don't know. That's not what we do. You need to check with the FDA. So I contacted the FDA and said, hey, we're looking to make, we're just trying to figure out what claims we can make about our foods. And when you talk with the FDA or any of these agencies, you're talking with someone. You're not talking with the deputy commissioner. You're just talking with someone who's answering the phones and doing their job. And whoever it was said, I don't know. I don't think that's what we do. You really need to talk with the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. So then the woman hung up on me. I called them. Almost the same thing. I said, you're the Federal Trade Commission. You regulate what we can and can't say about products and claims and all this. What can we say? They pushed me to the Consumer Product Safety Commission. And I was getting so frustrated. I'm like, please, just someone tell me what we can do.
And I guess I just didn't understand when I was reading it. I'm like, wait, this is not a Slinky. This is food we're going to put in our mouths. And they're turning you on to the guy who's going to make sure that, the safety glasses on your goggles are not going to shatter when, they're hit by an object. And that's the same individual that's going to tell me, what I should and shouldn't eat. So as we got that far, I was like, okay, this story has really gone off the rails, but go ahead and continue.
Yeah, no, but that's exactly right. I mean, they're sending us all over. We're just trying to figure out food. And it turns out none of them, the questions I was constantly asking or trying to find answers to was, we found out very quickly that they fall in between this gray area between the FDA and the USDA. The FTC and the Consumer Product Safety Commission actually shouldn't have had anything to do with us at that point, but they fell between the FDA and the USDA, which was really interesting because, for example, the USDA handles, this is just one example, but the USDA handles beef, the FDA handles seafood. And this was you might remember the salmon story from the book.
Yeah, because salmon basically wasn't covered by the USDA because they did poultry and beef and you had salmon, but because then I guess his supervisor just happened to see the fat content in a meal, decided that you guys couldn't do that anymore, even though it really wasn't his jurisdiction. It just didn't pass a certain smell test that they had, so they felt like they needed to chime in.
Yeah, and it had nothing to do with the fact that it was salmon, because they also did it with a couple beef meals that we were doing, but anything that had a certain amount of fat in it. And so he came and said, there's too much fat. Now, given salmon has healthy fat, it's good for you, but he said, there's too much fat. You can't call this a low fat or a lean, healthy meal, which is what you sell. So you're going to have to either stop and this is what I found out. Okay, well, we can't stop selling it. People like this now. We've been selling it for a while. He said, no, it's what you're going to have to do is put a bunch of sugar into the food. And I was, what do you mean put sugar in the food? What does that do? Why? He said, well, because anytime you see the low fat or reduced fat or no fat, what that's about, it's not about how much fat's in the food. It's about the ratio of fat to total grams of food in the package or container. And so what he told us to do was just put bread or pasta or something like that, which is typically what you see in like a frozen dinner that you get at the grocery store. And he said what that does is it ups the total grams of food by putting a bunch of pasta or bread in there, but there's no fat. It's just sugar. So the fat stays the same. It evens out the ratio. Now you can call it a low fat or a lean, healthy meal, which is horrible. But here's the crazy part. because now again, he was just regulating the claims around low fat. Because that was happening to a salmon meal, seafood meal, which the USDA doesn't regulate, he didn't care that we listed sugar on the label. I asked him, I said, okay, people are going to flip out when they see this amount of sugar. He said, well, don't put it on there then. Who cares? And then I tried to ask the FDA. I said, hey, because they regulate seafood. Hey, what's the deal? Like, what do we need to put on here? And they said, we don't know. You work with the USDA, so now you're out of our jurisdiction.
So it almost feels like, I mean, it's, and I've seen this in other parts of dealing with the government, and I don't really want to get political here, but they are more of a slap you when we think you're wrong. But as far as actually helping you comply with something that is just intelligent, that's not really there. I mean, and unfortunately in this whole deal, and that's part of the book. And I think this is a really good book for folks to get into, kind of just understand what real life is when you're trying to, sell healthy food, but at the same time meet the customer's demand for certain things when that's not always easy to define or not easy to segment in a way that makes sense for a growing business. And then there's these regulations that quite frankly aren't that easy to get through.
Right. I mean, that was kind of what I was alluding to earlier. The way the USDA works, they don't look at what we're doing in real time. The way it works is you document your processes and procedures, just everything that you do throughout the day. And then they come back in retrospect, they read everything. And what that causes all the time is, or what it invites, I guess, is for food companies to keep two different separate sets of books. So you got the one for what you actually did, and then one for what you want the USDA to see that you did. And, because of that, I mean, there's so many things wrong with it. Of course, obviously, they don't even know what you're actually doing because they're not watching. But also, the FDA is a very similar way, but they only catch you in retrospect. I have a email from the FDA and literally telling us, unless your food starts making people sick, unless we get calls from consumers telling us this, you'll never hear from us, which is exactly what you just said. I mean, it's in retrospect. They didn't care to inspect us up front, only, reprimand us if something goes wrong.
Yeah. And I guess I can see that from a little bit of their perspective is that, one, if it's not broken, don't fix it. So, unfortunately they say, if these guys aren't making people sick and people keep buying their food, they must be meeting the consumer's wants and needs. And you saw a little bit of that pressure as you kind of went through, which meant as a businessman and you're trying to make the right decisions, and obviously under a lot of pressure too, because you have employees and you have investors and a lot of other things going on in a rather crazy life that you seem to be living back then. But the food companies and even you, the way you had to start learning this stuff and running it was you kind of developed these tactics for understanding where that, how far within that gray area you could play without really running afoul.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, so if you could just kind of go through some of the tactics that you saw people using or that you were able to use to effectively hustle, as you put in the book, you're a food hustler, that basically, wasn't an intent to really go too far on this, but over time it gets pushed somewhat to that as you're looking at, the profit motive, the feeding the families, the taking care of the business, the doing all the things that a for-profit business is doing. These tactics are designed to allow you to sell the food to a customer that the customer wants because they're eating it and they keep buying it. But it kind of skirts the rules a little, or at least opaques things enough that it's a little difficult for us to truly trust the food label that's in front of us.
Right. Yeah. So, and again, these are not my tactics. Like, we didn't necessarily come up with these. We more learned them from the industry, whether other competitors, sometimes they were literally taught to us by the USDA. So yeah, these weren't my tactics, but yeah, let me give you some of these because these are things people definitely need to be aware of and look out for. So one of the big ones that you're allowed to use if you're creating meals which have more than one type of food to be eaten at the same time, for example, a frozen dinner, for example, right? It's got two different things or more to be eaten at the same time, or for children like Lunchables. Just to give a couple examples, well, this is called the discrete ingredients tactic. And what we're legally allowed to do is instead of listing all the ingredients in a meal, we'll sometimes be allowed to list the food items as the ingredients. So, for example, if you're reading a label, the ingredients, and you see something like sauce or cheese or juice, like fruit juice, for example, listed, what we're doing is we're allowed to list just that's the food. That's the big thing. There's plenty of more things inside a juice or a sauce, but because of this little loophole, we don't have to list them. And usually what's in those things is tons of sugar. So that's one way we get to hide it. So another one of these little tactics is the portion size tactic. So if you're a weight loss company, there's no regulation on what we have to, like we don't have to follow any procedure or any guidelines for portion sizes. We can make them whatever we want to.
Right. So you could have taken your 3 to 4 ounce salmon portion that you were selling earlier, we were talking about earlier, and rather than add, a starch or bread or something like that, or rice or whatever, you could have literally just taken that and said, we're going to cut the portion down to 3 ounces or 2 ounces. And that might have gotten you to the fat percentage where they would have felt comfortable to say, okay, you're good.
Yeah, that one probably, I don't know that specifically that one would have worked, just because if that's the only thing in the package, just salmon on its own has such a high percentage of healthy fats. I don't know. But to your point, yes. So here's another way we use this one. I'll give you an example. And this goes with so there's another tactic we use we call it the dwindling the serving size tactic. So trans fats. People are worried about trans fats.
Get us down below 0.5 gram and we don't even have to count it.
Exactly. So that's the loophole. So if there's less than 0.5 gram, we can call it 0. So whether there's 5 grams, 10 grams, 15, all we have to do is minimize the portion size and then up the servings per container is whatever we need to do to get it to where we can list 0. And no one cares that we do this. So if you're eating a health food and it says 0 grams of trans fat.
Yeah. And while we're on trans fat, because I've done some episodes on trans fats, but I literally want to just repeat this because I think this is extremely important. A trans fat is an artificial fat, a man-made fat that when it enters your body, it never leaves. So every bit of trans fat that you've ever eaten is going to stay in your body and poison you for the rest of your life. And so the government has now figured out through science that this is bad stuff and you should not be eating it. The fact that they even allow 0.5 gram or less in your food over time still accumulates. So, this is actually a pretty big deal when we start looking at this stuff. And so again, I really appreciate you bringing that up because that is a very important health issue for folks to consider, is that just because it says 0 trans fats does not mean there are no trans fats. It just means less than 1 gram.
Right. And your body doesn't know what to do with the stuff, just like you said. And the worst situation for this is in health foods, because sometimes non-health foods won't necessarily try to hide them. They don't necessarily have a reason because you're not eating those to be healthy. So the health foods are the ones that ironically and horrifically you have to watch out for hiding the trans fat. So on that note, I'll give you another great example of a tactic we used. We call this the polarizing tactic. I actually learned this from originally a competitor of mine. What he showed me that he would do, and that a lot of companies do, they'll put 2 different foods side by side, like for example on a shelf or in a freezer or wherever, and they'll list on one that, just for example, that this has trans fat and on the other one it doesn't, or this one's gluten-free or organic and this one is the opposite. And what he figured out, or what he taught me, was that they're going to be polarized one way or the other. Either they're buying because of the low price or they're buying because of a health benefit. And if they're buying because of the health benefit, what they think is in there, they're willing to pay more. But more often than not, they're not even that thing. The 2 foods sitting side by side are identical. Either they're already both organic or they're both not organic, and they're just changing one of the labels because they know people will pay more for the one that is perceived to be healthy, which is a horrible, horrible thing to do. But it's something you got to be on the lookout for because.
Oh, well, I mean, I would say it's horrible on one end if they're going in one direction, but if the individuals that are buying the cheaper meal because they're just going for the price are getting the same meal and it's organic and generally healthy. But obviously this was not the only topic that this competitor taught you. So there were other tactics that he was doing as well that probably tell me that he wasn't going in this direction with this that way, because it typically, again, isn't going to work in your favor. But again, many times generic foods that you buy are made by the same companies in the same process, the same way as the regular food that you would buy. Not that the regular food is all that much more healthy, but again, you're just not paying as much for the same unhealthy food.
Yeah, it's really just, and this actually leads into some of the other things we do. A lot of these are hand in hand, but yeah, it's not necessarily that someone's getting all that much of a better product or a worse product, which way they go. It's just manipulative in the sense that it may not be the truth that they're telling you, and they know you'll spend more money for people who are trying to buy what they think is the better option, whether or not it is or not. So a couple others that we use, the distribution tactic. So this is, in my opinion, one of the worst ones. So we know that one of the first things people look for on the label is grams of sugar, usually. And they also check the top ingredients. I don't know, your listeners are probably pretty sharp. They probably are very educated on what to look for. But, a lot of times your average consumer only looks for either the grams of sugar, the top few ingredients. Maybe they don't necessarily skim down the list. Of course, if there's a huge long list, that's a red flag immediately anyway. But what we'll do is, instead of using just, for example, sugar to sweeten the food, because we know people are checking those things, we'll break it up and use smaller amounts of many types of sugar, high fructose corn syrup, sucrose, sucralose, maltodextrin, you name it. And what that does is it allows us, so now, because there's not a large amount of any of those, we don't have to list it anywhere near the top of the ingredients list. And because half of them are, quote, fake sugars, we don't even have to list a good chunk of them on the nutrition facts, at least not until the new FDA rules come through, if they do.
Yeah. And I have actually done an episode and we actually did a sugar challenge in September, 30 days to cut our sugar. Unfortunately, we, for a lot of folks that are eating the processed foods, they're kind of, at the mercy of food companies to be a little bit more upfront with what they're putting in the food. If you're eating whole foods, you can look up the nutrition facts of an apple, and as long as that's still a medium-sized apple, you're pretty much going to know how much fructose is in that apple. There's no high corn syrup in an apple. The apple is just the fructose. It's just natural fruit sugars. But you know what it is. You know what you're eating.
Yeah, you know what you're eating. And so, all right, so that's a perfect segue for another one that we use. So when you're eating an apple, yeah, you don't necessarily have to check, but if you're checking, you know what's in there. You know there's not high fructose corn syrup in that apple. One thing we use, we called it masking scary words. It's a tactic, and we're allowed to do this, which is just mind-blowing, but we know people are freaked out by high fructose corn syrup. So sometimes what we would do, we were allowed to, was just, instead of high fructose corn syrup, we would list something that we know people weren't afraid of, like agave nectar. Now, you can't do that with things like an apple or whole foods, but if you're eating fake processed sweet tasting foods, I mean, you can bet that we're probably doing something like this. Another one is MSG. People are very paranoid about MSG on the label. Well, we're legally allowed to just not list that and instead call it something like soy protein or whey protein. And people have no way of knowing.
Now, there's one thing I want to segue in, and this is definitely in the book, and this is the part of the book that I think makes this book so valuable beyond what we're talking here with these tactics, because I think it's important for us to understand what our food labels are telling us and what they are not. But, I think that's a big part of it, is a lot of this stuff that tells us that MSG and high fructose corn syrup or this or that, they're funded by the very companies that sell competing products. And there's no reason for the apple farmer to go lobby Congress to tell people that apples are healthy.
Right. You won't find broccoli or kale making health claims about themselves.
Right. They don't have to. And, basically, if there's a study on it, it's only because some higher institution of learning wanted to do a study to understand a little bit more about the nutrients in that food. But it was not a well-funded study the way you would if you were looking at Monsanto or other, agricultural companies and what they would want to fund as an opportunity to say, let's prove this is healthy, or, let's make this a bigger part of the food product that people are eating because it adds to our bottom line.
Yeah. I mean, if you were so inclined, you could pay scientists to go out and find whatever you wanted them to find, for the most part, in anything. You could pay them to go find antioxidants in dirt or marijuana or anything, and then you could come back and do a report on it saying that, hey, it's good to eat dirt. or whatever, because those things are there. So yeah, that's what the corporations do a lot of the time. They're motivated, of course, to find these. The whole thing about there's chocolate is healthy, not that it can't be, but that's funded by the sugar industry, and they wanted to be able to say that, hey, in the cocoa leaf, there are antioxidants and vitamins and minerals and fiber. Of course, there's going to be that in anything that grows out of the ground. They wanted to be able to use it to teach people to eat their chocolate bars.
And you can, in moderation, eat chocolate to remain healthy. But, it's the whole point of saying, this is not the big brand, and I won't say their names. This is not the big brand chocolate bar we're talking about. This is the, 90% cacao, so that at that point, and again, that's a label, so we don't know, but unless you're going to go farm your own chocolate and make your own chocolate bar, you do still have to, in some cases, just go a little bit to say, I'm going to either trust this vendor or not. But, this kind of goes into some of the others is, there are these words that, and this is another one of your tactics, and you talk, so you call it the fat-free, sugar-free, gluten-free thing, is there's these trends that go through being very, very popular, so, gluten-free, or I was walking down the aisle one time and I saw this flaxseed cookie, and I'm like, it's a cookie made out with flax seeds in it. I'm like, okay, I understand that they want to say flax seeds are healthy, and therefore they've made a cookie with flax seeds. And so I turn over the label, and the first ingredient is flour, and the second ingredient is sugar. And yeah, you get down to like ingredient number 4 or 5, and there's flax seeds. So the entire outside of this thing is coated with flax seeds. There's probably no flax seeds on the inside of it. And the worst part of it was the flax seeds were whole flax seeds. You could see them. And I'm like, okay, well, a lot of people don't know this. Your body can't digest the outer hull of a flax seed. So unless the flax seed's ground, you're never actually going to digest that flax seed. And so I was like, oh my God, they literally are selling cookies that, they didn't even take the time to ground the flax seed, because that would have cost some money. They just literally just coated this thing with some flax seeds, a little bit of flax seeds, and called it a flaxseed cookie. And I just
that's actually, so we're doing a couple different things. I haven't done that specifically. My company didn't do that, but when the food industry does stuff like that, that's a couple different things. So one of it, we're using that flaxseed to do what we call label padding. And this is really, really common in any sector of any kind of health food. We'll take anything that's a buzzword or that we know that people think are healthy at the moment, like flax seeds, for example. And I guess they were kind of lazy, but sometimes people won't even, companies won't go that far. They'll just, sprinkle the tiniest bit, like you can't even see it. Maybe it's in there, maybe it isn't. But they're doing it just so they can pad the label with stuff that people perceive as healthy to sell you something that clearly isn't, which goes hand in hand with the other tactic that you mentioned, the fat-free, sugar-free, gluten-free. So this is what we're essentially doing. Now, we're not, of course, there are people who have, for example, gluten allergies, but we take it a step further and we'll say, we just get anything that we know that people have ever experienced. We'll say, have you ever had a upset stomach, IBS? Maybe that's because of gluten. Have you ever, had low back pain, for example? Maybe that's because you're eating too much gluten. And we kind of put those two things together to pad the labels with all the stuff that we know people want to see, and to it is tricking them, but to hide stuff that may not even be there in the first place. So here's a very crystal clear example. Cereal. They've been doing this since day one. They say they're low fat on cereals all the time. There's never been a fatty cereal. They're always really high in sugar. But what they're doing is saying, hey, look over here, we're low fat, we're pointing it out, because they're distracting you from realizing that it's mostly pure sugar.
And then that's the other side of, they'll sit there and they'll tell you there's fruit in the bottom of your yogurt. And it tastes delicious because there's actually more sugar in that little gooey substance at the bottom of that yogurt than there is actual fruit. And but they can tell you there's, fruit in the bottom and it's blueberry or acai berry, or, and you're like, okay, that I've heard that's healthy. I saw that in Reader's Digest, kind of a headline somewhere. So I know that's healthy.
Oh, absolutely. And we take it further. We do the whole distraction tactic thing. Well, I literally walked into a grocery store the other week and saw, I want to say it was cage-free grass-fed hot dogs. And I mean, I couldn't help but chuckle because whether or not any of those parts came from cage-free grass-fed animals, we don't know. But they're hot. They're hot dog. That's like saying cage-free grass-fed Twinkies. It's a Twinkie.
Yeah, well, I don't keep my Twinkies in a cage.
Right. We all want our Twinkies grass-fed.
Well, I don't know if it ate the grass. I didn't sit out there and watch it eat the grass, but it had the opportunity. Let's just say it's free range. Right. It was a free range Twinkie.
That's right. No one was. Yeah. I was just going to say, and one you kind of touched on a little earlier was the ingredients claims. Like anytime the food is saying anything about itself, like you said, broccoli and kale and blueberries and all that stuff. It doesn't have a reason to promote. The apple farmers, they're not going to spend money to promote the fact that their food is healthy. Plus, we all kind of already know that if we stop and think about it. Anytime a food's making a claim like that, it's because they're trying to convince you of something you wouldn't know otherwise. You wouldn't know to eat a candy bar. You would never think to do that when you're trying to lose weight. But if they do a lot of research or pay scientists to do specific research and put on the front of that candy bar that it contains vitamins and minerals and it's good for people who are running long distances, well, now all of a sudden you might eat that candy bar when you otherwise would never think to.
Yeah, and they label it Power Bar instead of candy bar. It's true. I mean, the sugar in that and the protein, they are going to give you energy for you to do exercise. But if you're not doing the exercise, then effectively all you're doing is eating a candy bar.
Exactly. Yeah, and so then that kind of brings me to a big one that I don't think anyone's really aware of this tactic that the food industry uses. So I was taught this by the same guy that taught me a lot of these other things, same company. It's called the cleaning up the ingredients tactic. And what we'll literally do is follow food activists. And whatever it is that they're teaching people to avoid or to get more of, but usually it's to avoid something, we'll comply with them and just kind of, admit, like, you know what, they're right. We're going to switch this up now. We're going to do what they're saying. And people think this is a good thing at first, but it's actually really harmful. And I'll give you an example why. I think the Food Babe is really, you're familiar with the Food Babe, I think?
I am, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So she does this a lot. She does the petitions, and she goes against the big, like General Mills, and gets them to change their ingredients. What she may or may not realize they're doing is saying, oh, you're saying that this dye that we're using in our food is bad, so we'll rework our ingredients so that it doesn't have this dye anymore. Now, assuming they're actually doing that, which I have no idea, they may or may not, but even if they are, here's the reason it's bad is because people stopped when Food Babe said, hey, don't eat this, macaroni and cheese because it has this yellow dye in it. So they take that out. All of a sudden, people swarm back to it, and they say, "Oh, it's safe now. It doesn't have this." They're eating macaroni and cheese again, and you could do that with any food. They do it with candy.
Well, even worse than that, because now, and as you kind of put in the book, is unfortunately because she has really just called that one ingredient out as the bad guy. The food company becomes the good guy by taking on the bad guy, and distracts you from the fact that, well, quite frankly, the whole food was the bad guy. The food company wasn't the good guy in this deal at all. They just reconfigured their ingredient list, found a different way to do it. It might have cost them a couple more cents, but now she's going to actually sell more of their stuff because she's going to tout that she accomplished this great task of moving the mountain. And she did it for good reason, as you noted in the book, but it's just kind of one of those things of saying, the kale industry doesn't have to say they're GMO free. They don't have to say they're sugar free. They don't have to say they're low in sugar. They don't have to make those claims that there's no artificial sweeteners or flavorings in kale. You might not like kale, but I think you can prepare it in a way that is very healthy and still tastes very good. There are other leafy green vegetables that you can get into your diet. But all those foods that are really food, whole food, are there. They're available to us. We walk past them in the grocery store. In fact, most grocery stores make you walk past them to get to the bad stuff in the back of the floor. So you almost always walk through a produce section when you walk into a grocery store. And that's where you should just almost do a full stop and do most of your shopping right there near the door.
Absolutely. I mean, because most of us, I think, eat gluten-free really without trying. You don't have to if you're eating whole foods, usually. I mean, you just do it by default. But when people are told, hey, now that this food over here from this company took the gluten out of it, people don't want to go and eat the kale or the whatever, the whole food. They want to go and eat, a lot of the times, the cookie. They want permission to eat these cookies over here that now don't have gluten, so they're good. Or like I said, the macaroni that now took the dye out. It makes the food company look like the good guy. The Food Babe or whoever is talking about it. They're not doing it on purpose, but they're inadvertently helping these companies sell a whole lot more of those processed junk foods just by teaching people, like you said, that ingredient, whatever it is at the time, is the bad thing when it's the food always.
And I've heard these stories over and over of, a kind of, I guess what we would call a rock star blogger or podcaster will come in and say, this is a bad ingredient, and everybody is like going, and it causes all this fervor, and then everybody's going to try to stay away from it for a while, and then the company comes back and changes it, and you're like, okay, but they're not the only one doing that. And so it's probably other places that this person hasn't found yet. And so you're probably still eating as much of it if you're eating at the shop right next door. But the other side is it does make them look like heroes. And now people are not necessarily focusing on the true overall quality of their food. They've been distracted.
Right. And again, I'll point out that if the thing, for example, like we already talked about, is MSG, we can really, and it's not just about MSG. I'm just using that because we talked about it. If that's the thing we're supposed to take out of our food, the companies don't always necessarily do that. Sometimes they just take it off the label. It's still there. So you're absolutely eating the same amount of it. They're just showing you now that,
or they label it something else, because there are other terms that are basically the same chemical component. It just has a different name. So yeah. It's a tough thing. If you're going to eat food that comes in a box that's packaged by somebody, you are somewhat at their mercy to for them to be honest with you and open with you. And it's not in their financial interest to do so. So, buyer beware. But I think one of the cool things about this was, you've said this a couple of times. You still kind of say it in the present tense because I think you're not completely past this, but we do. But the reality is, Jeff, you're not doing this anymore. You've come over to the light side, and now you're shining a light on food quality that I think a lot of people need to pay attention to. So with your book, Big Fat Food Fraud, I really do think this is a book that will kind of shed some light for folks. And we did get deep into this today, but reality is this book is going to show you the true story of what it's like to be under the pressure of running a food business and trying to meet the demands that are multiple and complicated, and just trying to do the right thing, but trying to be successful at the same time. And I really appreciate the story of this because it really did kind of bring to light that, it's not like there's a bunch of evil people working at food companies saying, how can we poison America? It's people that are trying to make a living and do the right thing, but at the same time in a very complex and difficult market. So I really do appreciate the book. I know folks will go out and buy this book because it's really a treasure, and I really appreciate having the opportunity to speak with you, Jeff.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on here to talk about it.
So if someone wanted to get in touch with you, buy the book or whatnot, where would you like for me to send them?
Yep, you can contact me and or find information about the book and everything else at bigfatfoodfraud.com.
Okay, cool. Well, this is episode 181. So you can find the show notes for this episode at 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/181. And I'll have all the links to Jeff's stuff there, the link to the book and a link to his website. So again, Jeff, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate having you.
No, again, thank you for having me so much. It was great.
Really has you wondering about what's on those food labels, doesn't it? Next time on the 40 Plus Fitness Podcast, we speak with Sue Hitzman and discuss her book, The Melt Method, a breakthrough self-treatment system to eliminate chronic pain, ease the signs of aging, and feel fantastic in just 10 minutes a day. Until then, have a happy and healthy day.